Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and today I'm joined by Alex Stewart.
Hello, Joe.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Looking forward to talking about shirt numbers with you.
I suppose whatever works for you.
Yes, exactly. So, listen, we released a video on the Tifo YouTube channel today, as you're listening to this, all about shirt numbers and why in different countries, different positions traditionally have different shirt numbers. Now, we know that nowadays a lot of players just pick whatever number they want, and the numbers don't really correspond to their positions on the pitch. But there is a grand history behind the reason why they originally did and why they were originally different. So, this is what we're going to discuss today. How exciting. Before we do that, though, I would like to say that you should check out The Athletic. If you visit theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90, that's the numbers 90, Tifo90, you can get wait for it, it's a new one, Alex. Can you guess what it is?
I'm going to guess that it's a 90-day free trial.
It is. Imagine that. You know how many months that is? 90 days?
Well, I mean, it depends on how many days there are in those months.
That's exactly the right answer, and I was really hoping you would say 3 so I could throw that in your face, but you threw it in mine first. Those who throw the first stones suffer the largest consequences. Hey, it's 3 months. That's 3 months for free, just long enough to forget that you aren't paying for it and for it to turn over and for you to start paying for it. Oh, they've done it again. Not really, but listen, you get 3 months to oh God, who needs more of a free trial than that? I mean, you know, I knew within day one, hey, I'm going to pay for this for the rest of my life, even though they gave it to me for free. But for you, 90-day free trial is excellent, and we're going to talk about why in the middle of this episode as well, because this the shirt numbers video that we released half corresponds with something that Michael Cox has been doing on The Athletic, which are very interesting reads and go into a lot more depth than our video does. Anyway, that's theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90, the number's 90, Tifo90, 90-day free trial. Okay, enough of that. Now for the episode. Right, Alex, shirt numbers are mostly different in defence. Why?
Right. So,
I mean, from country to country, I should have specified that.
Sure, but yes. So the basic reason for that is that the original... So numbering came in during the 1930s. In the UK, well, I should say England, really, because the FA just governs England. But it became compulsory in 1939. Prior to that, there were instances of numbering that were on and off. It was about the same sort of time that the evolution from what we would call 235 started to become what we would call WM in England. Now, there are various kind of tactical evolutions that occur in this period of time. Some countries use a WW, some use an MM. I would always recommend reading Jonathan Wilson's Inverting the Pyramid if you want to get to grips with this stuff. But basically, the 235 was numbered from right to left, back to front, basically. So the right back was 2, the left back was 3, then you went across the half backs, 4, 5, 6, and so on. As that formation changed, as the 235 changed and initially became the WM, so you have 3 backs, then 2 half backs, and then forwards, the position that dropped back to make that third line or that third man in defence was different from country to country. So in England, for example, it was the number 5 that dropped back, and part of the reason for that was in Herbert Chapman's original WM. That 5 position was sort of almost like a quarterback in the sense that they had a kind of, as well as a defensive position, they also were the person who would initiate counterattacks with long-range passing. They would occasionally bring the ball forwards, and it felt more natural for that to be the 5. And so you were left then with the numbering in the WM being 2-5-3 across the back. Different countries did it differently. So in some instances, for example, in Argentina, the outside right half dropped back into the right back space, which is kind of logical. In Uruguay, it was even more logical because the left half back went left, the right half back went right, and so the numbering you would see would be 4-2-3-6 if you're reading from right to left. So that the basic answer is because different countries dropped a different player into the defensive line to make that defensive line.
Right, okay. Before we go any further on shirt numbers, I just want to take this opportunity to ask you about the WM, because that doesn't come up very often. What was the W? I mean, I know you just explained the formation there, but why did it work so well, and why did it dominate football for eons?
Well, so part of the reason that it evolved was as a response to a change in the offside law. So there were now fewer players allowed between the goal and the player in possession when the ball was, the player who was receiving possession. What that meant was that teams needed to have a bit more defensive solidity, otherwise they could quite easily be caught out. Bearing in mind with the 2-3-5, you had effectively, unless the halfbacks were dropping back considerably, you could have 5 players pretty much running at 2 fullbacks. And a goalkeeper. So in order to compensate for that, and the what were called the inside players, the inside right, the inside left, so 8 and 10, they would drop back and they became more of a kind of central midfielder as we would see, but with, say, someone like a Kevin De Bruyne or a David Silva who also gets forward. It was basically about balancing that up and giving additional cover. But because Chapman didn't just want to be defensive, that centre-half position, which is why in England we call centre-back centre-half sometimes, because that's what he was, a number 5, there would also be that kind of playmaking capacity there. So long-range pass or carrying the ball forwards, kind of a bit like a sweeper. And it one of the reasons that formation changes work is partly because no one else has done them yet. So, if you start to make changes that address particular problems that you're finding because the opposition are doing certain things, if you're the first person to make that change, you kind of catch everyone on the hop.
Do you know what my favourite change was? Having read Jonathan Wilson's Inverting the Pyramid, my favourite change, I guess a little bit before this, was when they started passing the ball. I really loved the passage in his, but it's really near the beginning if anyone wants to pick up a copy and read it. There's a bit where he talks about how players didn't really pass the ball. When they picked it up, they would run with it until they got tackled. And the person who tackled them would then run with it until they got tackled. So I just thought of that because you were describing, 5 forwards running at 2 defenders, and in the modern game, that's carnage and a definite goal. In the olden days game, the olden times game, that's 1 player running against 2 defenders, and in some cases, I just love the idea that they hadn't worked that out yet.
Well, it is very interesting. So they talk about, and again, this is all from Wilson stuff. The idea of backing up, which was running next to a player who was head down and dribbling on the off chance that the ball kind of ricocheted out of a tackle and you might gather it. But it wasn't because that player would then kind of draw the man in and then chip it sideways. And it was a very, very distinct difference between the way football was played in Scotland, where players did pass the ball, and in England, where they just ran.
So the first time they played, England got absolutely hammered, didn't they? When they first played Scotland.
Yeah, well, I think Scotland were fielding effectively like a representational team from one particular club, and I want to say Queen of the South, but that's probably wrong,
right?
Because I can't remember. But yes, it was effectively that, and England were, much bigger. They were about a stone heavier. They were. It kind of almost, if you look at the report of it and the way that people were judging the outcome ahead of time based on fitness, speed, and strength, it reads like a rugby team playing another rugby team, where it's like, the little quick guys who could actually string passes together surprisingly beat the big heavy ones.
Right, yeah.
It's quite a weird way to look at football. But, the things have evolved so much in the 150 years we're talking about.
Well, let's follow that trajectory. From the WM to 4 at the back, that transition obviously took a while, and it happened at different times in different places, and as you describe, in different ways in different places. Was there anywhere that it happened almost immediately?
Well, again, according to Wilson, and I think Michael Cox makes this point in his series as well, in Uruguay, it was pretty much a seamless transition from a 2-3-5 to a back 4.
Yeah. And does that mean a 4-4-2, or does that just mean a back 4?
Well, generally speaking, in South America, what happened was that it kind of went to a 4-2-4. Right. So those two inside players, one of them dropped back, and there was obviously still a half-back left there, which in South America is always a 5. And then they would be alongside an 8, who was a kind of shuttley player. The front line of the 4 in South American football, particularly in Brazilian football, which is really where the 4-2-4 originated. And it is worth noting that one of those central defenders would still be encouraged to step forwards and to kind of almost bulk out the midfield in transition. So it wasn't a pure, like, rigid back 4. But also in that position, the 10 would kind of hang back. So you almost had this staggered effect where one of the centre-backs would push forwards a little bit, kind of alongside the 5, but not quite. Then there'd be an 8 slightly ahead of them. Then slightly ahead of them would be a 10. And then you'd have 3 attackers, two wide players and a pure centre-forward. So it's not like this was a sudden thing where, overnight there was a back 4 and it was a rigid back 4 in the sort of George Graham Arsenal style. It was more fluid and more evolutionary than that. And tactics are kind of driven by two things. So the first is a manager who has the imagination and the wherewithal to respond to a kind of a prevailing way of playing football and think, oh, well, if I tweaked this, if I did something different, maybe that would surprise people. Look at Antonio Conte using a back 3 in the Premier League. I mean, that was suddenly, oh, what is this? We don't know what to do with it. The other thing is that sometimes teams will adapt because they have a particular player who does a particular thing extremely well. So, for example, the idea of a striker, a number 9, dropping back and playing in the half space, which is sort of ultimately come to be known as a false 9.
I think of Pirlo when you say that, though.
Pirlo?
I think of Pirlo when you say that as having him playing deeper in the creative role to give him more space, but and then the team builds around him.
Yes, so that's definitely the case team by team. But in terms of kind of broader innovations that then start to manifest more widely, with Austria in the 1930s and a player called Matthias Sindelar, and then Hungary in the 1950s with Nandor Hidekuti, you see players who their natural game almost forces a shift that then transitions more widely, and people start to understand that maybe playing an attacking midfielder in the half space off a striker is a good idea, or maybe formations don't need to be quite as fixed. I mean, the Pirlo thing is a really good example of how individual teams can change to maximize the benefit. But Pirlo started life as a kind of trequartista. He started playing as a 10 in the hole behind strikers. And he just wasn't very fast, so they kind of dropped him back and protected him in that way. But this is why tactics is so interesting, is because these things, they all sort of relate to one another. So if you then have a player who's regularly doing that, you have to think about, do I have a player who steps forward to mark them? Do I have a player who drops back? And when England played that Hungary side, there were confusions about the numbers that the Hungarians were wearing. But again, it caused the English defenders to think, do I step forwards and effectively make myself a midfielder to follow this guy? Or do I hold my position in the back line, in which case he's in lots of space? And it forces coaches to then think and solve those problems further down the line. And that's how you get the evolution of tactics.
So what are some other modern examples of a player who plays a slightly unusual role that the team has then built around? I mean, someone comes to mind for me. I don't know whether the second part of that question fits with Thomas Müller. I'm not sure whether Bayern ever really built around him, but they definitely found a way to facilitate his talents that weren't immediately obvious and didn't necessarily fit in naturally to their football style.
Yeah, I mean, Muller's a really weird example, isn't he? Because he's somebody who has, he's played on effectively kind of like a right wing position. He's played in the hole behind one striker, behind two. He's played as a striker, and he has a set of attributes to do with movement, finding space. Also, he's a very intelligent presser of the ball. He's a very disciplined and tactically smart player. And there you kind of look at Bayern as thinking, how do we fit this guy in? I think he's almost too odd to have that idea of something being built around him. But there's no question at all that successive Bayern coaches will have thought about how do we get the best out of Müller in terms of where he fits into the side and where he fits with other players, because he's not the sort of person that you want to leave out, because his goal scoring record is excellent. He's incredibly hardworking. He's, and it does. These are the tricky questions that coaches have to answer. And where does Thomas Müller fit would be a good one. And that that obviously makes the selection decisions that then have to be made in terms of. So if you go back to Pirlo, for example, playing two very, very workmanlike midfielders. I mean, the two obvious examples are Ambrosini and Gattuso. Playing them kind of alongside and ahead of Pirlo in order to ensure that he didn't have to do any of that work, that he didn't have to really tackle people or cover lots of distance. Again, so it's not just necessarily the tactical system. Then you might have more talented footballers who don't get played because they don't fit in with what everybody else is trying to do.
Which is a fascinating topic of discussion, and I think there are plenty of players that can fit into that mold. I mean, someone who comes to mind immediately is Mesut Ozil, and also I was reading Adam Crafton's piece on The Athletic this morning. It's all about data science, and he references a time when Memphis Depay was at Manchester United. He was struggling under Jose Mourinho, not playing any games, and this is just before he moved to Lyon, and his agent contacted a data science team to provide, some assistance in terms of locating or isolating a good transfer for him. And they asked him a lot of questions about how he wanted to play. One of the things that he said was that he wanted the freedom to play. And that he didn't, essentially he struggled with the defensive duties that were being asked of him at Manchester United, and he was looking for somewhere where that wasn't going to be the case. Lyon was top of the list, and eventually he moved there, and I think it's a very interesting story, but it strikes me that there are probably quite a few players who in certain teams will be incredible and could be considered the best player, some of the best players in the world. Pirlo is a perfect example of that. If you stuck Pirlo at number 10 forever and expected him to be the same player, without the team around him doing that obviously wouldn't be the case. And I think Mesut Ozil, is a really good example of, I guess, someone who is a classic number 10 who doesn't any longer play in a game or in a country that prizes the classic number 10.
Well, the 10 is the role where it's most evident, I think, that these changes occur. And I know that we, on the list of ideas that we've got for other things to address, that what happens with 10s and why do they go in and out of fashion is a really interesting topic. And if you look at the way that the Argentine national side built itself around Maradona, for example, playing in the 10 role, effectively all 11 players all 9 outfield players were there to fulfill a function for Maradona. And you do sometimes get the impression that the most creative players, and this is not by any stretch of the imagination to say that creative players are otherwise lazy or don't play for the team or what have you, but they need to be able to do the thing that they're really good at. And it's quite unusual to find a 10 who is both extremely competent in an attacking sense, but is able to do the defensive work and is able to, without...
Wayne Rooney.
Well, actually, interestingly, I've just, for another Tifo Football Encyclopedia video, I've been looking at Jose Mourinho's Inter Milan, and Wesley Sneijder is a really good example of somebody who could do that and could be incredibly disciplined in a defensive sense and fulfill his duties superbly while also being a really, really good creative midfielder. So
do you remember the heady days of Schneider to United? that transfer rumour rumbling on for at least 100 years.
Yes.
Which always struck me as odd. I mean, you bring that up after I mentioned Wayne Rooney. It always struck me as odd that would be something that club would be interested in, given that they had Wayne Rooney, who does the same thing. How do you play those two players in the same team? Maybe that's a good Tifo video. Revisiting what could have been. How would Schneider and Rooney have possibly fit in the same team? Maybe they would have.
Maybe they would have. I mean, there's two ways immediately spring to mind, but maybe you just want me to do the script instead. But it is interesting, and there does often seem to be, when you look at teams, rather than sort of looking at tactics as a whole, but if you look at the creation of teams and their tactics individually, the tension very often seems to exist between, we've got a Mesut Ozil or a Lionel Messi or a Riquelme or whoever. How do we fit that player into our team and allow them to be as good as they can be at the thing that they excel at and cover off everything else? And the inherent tension between giving a team enough balance to be able to defend successfully, but also to facilitate the attacking brilliance of that kind of playmaker. And as you know, as football has become more athletic, as there's been a greater degree of pressing, as teams have worked on, being able to transition from incredible compactness to incredible openness, there are certain players who have kind of struggled to adapt to that in quite the same way. And playmaking, the ability to create, doesn't really reside in one player in one kind of area of the pitch, being able to pull the strings and do all this stuff in the way that it kind of did for a period. And it's odd because prior to that period, that wasn't the case either. Again, it's sort of, it might be a generational thing. There might just be a number of players that come out at a similar kind of time, and they need to be catered for. There's just something that happens in the water where you get a run of amazing number 10s. And
I think that's true. And actually, before we move on a broader point, I would like to ask you a question now. Is this because of my age and my poor perception, or were footballers better in the 2000s than they are now? Were there not more better footballers? Is that insane of me to think? Because I do think that. I think maybe it's just my sort of skewed perception on what makes a good footballer. You mentioned Wesley Sneijder, Wayne Rooney, even people like Robin van Persie at Arsenal and Thierry Henry. Incredible players, game-changing players. And they had a bit of everything about their game. I feel like players are very specialised now, and that suits the game today, and that makes sense. And maybe teams are better, but I just feel like, particularly thinking of that golden era England team that didn't ever win anything, were they not better, Alex?
I mean, it's really hard to tell, isn't it? I think what's interesting is that there were
Steven Gerrard,
particularly Paul Scholes,
Frank Lampard. Go on.
Well, Lampard's one of the best midfielders England's ever produced, isn't he? He's just an astonishingly good player, and in some weird way doesn't necessarily get mentioned in the same breath as some of the others. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Chelsea fan, because I'm not. I think when you had teams basically all playing 4-4-2, the creative and exciting element was usually out wide and sometimes with the smaller of the two strikers who would drop off and play in the hole a little bit.
David Beckham, Michael Owen.
Well, no. I mean, but yes, okay. As that changed and you started to have things like a midfield diamond or a Christmas tree formation or ways of encouraging that creative 10 player who could do certain things that no one else could, that did kind of coincide with this period to a degree. I mean, it sort of started in the mid-90s and then carried on for about 10 years. And there's a definite thing of certain kinds of players. I don't want to say they're better or worse, but there's a certain type of player who, in a certain kind of formation, catches the eye a lot more than another type of player in another kind of formation. You know, it's a lot harder to very fondly remember a right back in a 4-4-2. And they might have been incredible. I mean, okay, Dennis Irwin, for example, as a left back in Man United, was one of the most consistently brilliant players the Premier League's ever seen, right? But when you think of great Man United players, you don't necessarily think of Dennis Irwin. You know, there are other people who will spring to mind, and many of them will be creative players. And that's just an inherent bias that a lot of people have when they're watching football. And so when you have a number of really talented players and you have formational changes that mean that there are systems that are built around those players and highlight their abilities, and it's before everybody else has kind of thought about how to adapt to that, you do get these little golden periods where all of a sudden you think, goodness me, like Baggio, wow. But it's partly, you know, I think, for example, we might be, if you look at the use of Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson at Liverpool, maybe we're sort of in the high point of the age of the fullback. You know, when you look at how much money Man City spent on the fullbacks they've got, when you look at the continuing importance of people like Marcelo at Real Madrid or
Philip Lahm's grandchildren.
Munich. Yeah, Philip Lahm was a different kind of player, but Joshua Kimmich definitely is in that mould. And you wonder whether, you know, what is going to be, people sometimes contact us and say, you know, what do you think will be the next tactical shift? And I think the next tactical shift could be, how do we negate the attacking capabilities of fullbacks by almost playing, you know, a lot of fullbacks used to be wingers, and you kind of wonder whether maybe the next thing is that you do a sort of Christian Chivo in that 2010 Inter game. You play a fullback as a midfielder, and you almost play like a winger type fullback as your fullback, and you're the attacking order of the team is slightly skewed because of what you're trying to achieve with that. I don't know. I mean, that's, yeah. But I think we're in the age of the fullback.
Well, we were talking about 10s before, and I would like to direct us now to a Michael Cox article. I mean, a series of articles, iconic shirt numbers on The Athletic. I really enjoyed the number 10 one particularly. I know we were talking about Maradona before, and there's a great quote in that article where he says that Riquelme was considered almost more of an Argentinian 10 than Maradona was, because he had some, I suppose, difficulties playing in Europe, you know, and that sort of would be considered the traditional Argentinian 10. I love the idea that even in country specific, different places, different numbers have different expectations and different characteristics, and the Argentinian 10 is a particularly interesting one to me.
Yeah. Definitely. No, it's a great article, and as you say, there's a whole series of these articles, and what's really nice is that they explain things about those positions, but they also highlight particular players who excelled while wearing those shirt numbers, and it's really worth a read. But it's interesting with someone like Riquelme, because obviously at Villarreal he did, you know, he was an exceptional player, but there is that thing about, and you sometimes see it with Brazilian 10s as well, where they just somehow don't quite adapt to the physicality of European football, which is an odd thing, because actually South American football, they kick lumps out of each other. So it's not that kind of physicality. It's more the pace. It's more the ability to find that little bit of room and time to do something different and out of the ordinary. But when Riquelme was on song, he was an absolutely beautiful player to watch.
Oh, for sure.
And I think, you know, that he draws Cox draws the contrast with Maradona and Messi, who had that kind of low center of gravity, that kind of aggressive dribbling and the speed to be able to do that, whereas Riquelme was more upright, more languid, more kind of almost tried to exist within his own little bubble where he was operating at a slightly slower speed than everyone else. But
maybe a bit of a Pirlo.
Well, kind of, yeah. And you wonder whether, again, if footballing fashions had evolved differently, and I don't know which team Riquelme came from in Argentina, but you know, whether players like that might have ended up playing a bit deeper. I mean, the Argentinian five is, to me, is a really fascinating position, because you do have some fives like Fernando Redondo or Fernando Gago, even if you're being kind, someone like Lucas Billa, who are kind of a bit like a Pirlo, but they're also a bit like a Gattuso, and they're not quite one thing, they're not quite the other. I mean, some Argentinian fives are just pure destroyers, and they're great, but yes, you do have little shifts. I guess someone like Riquelme just wasn't defensively capable. It's probably more the way they think about it is defense first, and if they happen to be able to pass the ball really nicely, then that's all to the good.
I just love the idea that you know, culture contributes to national characteristics that are as refined and as sort of what's the right word? Like what is the word when it's set in? You know, the cultural consciousness. Yeah, it's inherent to that specific location. I find that fascinating.
You know, if you read again, to cite Jonathan Wilson, but this time Angels with Dirty Faces, which is his history of Argentinian football. The character of I don't know if it's Peeb or Pibe, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but this sort of almost like a street urchin figure who is tricky and charismatic and a little bit naughty, but fundamentally not a bad human being.
I'm really good at football.
And it then, yes, it gets transferred into the idea of a Maradona. I mean, Maradona is like the classic Pibe or Peeb, because he has these, but it's kind of like a folk figure almost, and becomes incredibly important to that identity. And I think if you looked maybe at English football, it would be
Have we got a Pibe?
Well,
Robin Hood.
In that sense, well, it's. I mean, I guess, yes, probably, but there, I don't think there's a figure that translates as easily. But I do think that the idea of a classic brave central defender, you know, someone like a Terry Butcher with his head all bandaged up, that kind of plays into an idea that the English have of being, you know, stout and resolute and maybe not, you know, very fussy, but prepared to put themselves on the line for things. And that's why those sorts of players are revered in a way that, you know, maybe other kinds of players aren't. Yeah.
Well, anyway, if you want to read Michael Cox's piece, you can do so by triggering your 90-day free trial. That's theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90, the numbers 90. For a 90-day free trial, you could read that. In 90 days, you could read all of Michael Cox's work and more. I would highly encourage you do so. Why not? It's free for 90 days. Right. The last question I've got for you, really, Alex, is the one I'm most interested in hearing your answer for. It's about sort of the global dominance of some of those domestic number uses. So we were just talking about the Argentinian 10, for example, and how that might have imprinted on the wider world. The one I'm interested in is the European 6 as a defensive midfielder, or the Sechser, as you call it in the script in Germany. Because, you know, you also mentioned that in England, at least, that was traditionally the 4 role. And I guess that's why, you know, Steven Gerrard wore that number, for example. But we definitely do not call it the 4 now we call it the 6, right? That has totally infiltrated English football culture, and for the better, as far as I'm concerned. But why is that? Is that just because there were a number of popular and talented European defensive midfielder 6s, and that's just taken hold, or is it because there were more European players playing in the Premier League, for example? What do you think?
I think it probably is that. I think also there seems to be more of a tie that certain countries have to certain numbers. So, we talked about Argentina prizing the 10 and the 5 particularly, and I think in German football particularly, that the kind of really no-nonsense defensive midfielder, the sort of the Didi Harmon or someone, is a kind of player that is venerated there because, again, they embody certain qualities that maybe are particularly highly prized. They're extremely hardworking, they're extremely diligent, they sacrifice themselves for the team. And so for them, the idea of a 6 is it's not just a shirt number, it embodies certain things that, when Germany have won World Cups, they've had extremely talented attacking players, but there's always been that sense of, when West Germany beat Holland, for example, in 74, it's that, it's the hard-working Germans, they're diligent, they're focused, they've got a team ethic. And if there's a player who embodies that more than any other player, it is that kind of defensive midfielder. So I think they get... So yeah, I don't want to say that those shirt numbers take on a kind of mythic quality, because I think that's overstating it. But I think that having a shorthand for a fairly defined role that is also a role that carries respect and is prized is something that you get. And then that comes across, and those sorts of players do. When the Premier League really started to open itself up to foreign players, a lot of them were in that kind of mold to start with. We weren't, generally speaking, going out and buying super creative players to come over. We were buying, Scandinavian centre-backs and German defensive midfielders. And there's some good stuff in Michael Cox's book Zonal Marking about this, and also The Mixer, actually. So yeah, I don't know, but then in England we've got the Makelele role, which is still kind of referred to, although I sort of feel like that's dying out slightly.
Hey, not if Tifo has anything to do with it.
Well, sure. But also the proliferation of tactical writing online. A lot of the good tactical writers are publishing in English, but they aren't necessarily English writers.
Sure.
So they're importing terminology that they're comfortable with and that they use. So that, these things proliferate.
What I liked as well most from the script was the idea that although you can choose whatever number you want, and although squad numbering has completely changed that 1 to 11 thing, so the traditional numbers and traditional positions aren't really relevant anymore, that players are still drawn to it. I like the idea that kind of tells you something about a player as well, not necessarily what they're like on the pitch, but how they see themselves. If Memphis Depay joins Manchester United and wants to be the number 7, that says something about Depay, either that he's asking for that or that he's willing to take on the role. Similarly, I remember when Antonio Valencia gave it back and took back 25 because the pressure of the number 7 was too much for him. That tells you something about him as well. So I like the idea that although it's sort of irrelevant, it does still give us possibly some information or some insight into a player's character or temperament or view of themselves.
Yeah, there's definitely a resonance there, and I think there are two versions of that. I think one is the club version. So obviously at Manchester United, the number 7 is a thing,
which carries commercial value, I suppose.
Carries huge commercial value, huge weight of expectation, and all the rest of it, and that's largely, I'd say, Best and Cantona are the two major reasons for that. And then you have this nationality one, the Argentine 10, the Brazilian 10, the German 6. Again, it's like a statement of intent. This is the kind of player that I want to be, and I think usually it implies assuming a kind of responsibility. I want, if you're making yourself a Brazilian 10, you're saying, I'm going to be the one who makes things happen. if I'm a Manchester United number 7, I'm the one who'll produce the moment of magic when nobody else can. And that's, that does speak to a player's character, I think.
Very interesting. Anyway, that's the end of the podcast now. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Joe.
And, well, that was I've never heard you that excited. Or animated, I should say. That's the end. Next week, we will be back with something else, which is similar to that. In fact, we've got two now. Two now. Don't know what either of them are, because we've sort of said that we'll do 2. Don't know what they are. So, there'll be 2, but much in the same way that there's been 1 before. So, just expect twice as much of what you've already had, and nothing more, please. Just that. Yeah? Is that exciting?
Oh, yeah. Obviously. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. See you later. Au revoir.